Welcome, dear listeners, to another peaceful journey through the corridors of history. I'm Thomas, your gentle guide tonight, as we drift into the extraordinary life of Alexander the Great. Close your eyes and imagine a world over 2,000 years ago. Vast, mysterious, and filled with rising empires and legendary battles. In the hills of Macedonia, a 20-year-old named Alexander inherits a small kingdom. But unlike most, he dreams beyond borders. In just over a decade, he builds an empire spanning 3 continents, from the Mediterranean to the edges of India. His story is one of bold vision, brilliant strategy, and impossible ambition made real. So as you settle in and let sleep take hold, we'll quietly explore how one young man changed the world forever. Now take a deep breath, relax, and let us begin. In ancient Macedonia.
The year is 336 BCE, and the morning mist clings gently to the hills of Pella, the ancient capital of Macedonia. In the royal palace, a young man named Alexander awakens to news that will change his life forever. His father, King Philip II, has been assassinated. At just 20 years old, Alexander must now shoulder the weight of a kingdom and the dreams of a father who had already begun to reshape the Greek world. But let us drift back a little further to understand how this remarkable young man came to be. Alexander was born in 356 BCE, on a day when legend tells us the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned to the ground. The soothsayers whispered that this was an omen, that a child born on this day would one day bring fire to Asia. Whether we believe such tales or not, there's something soothing in imagining how the threads of destiny were already being woven on that distant summer day. His mother, Olympias, was a princess from the wild mountains of Epirus, known for her fierce temperament and her devotion to mysterious religious rites. She would tell young Alexander stories of his divine heritage, claiming that his true father was not Philip, but Zeus himself, king of the gods. Picture the young boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, sitting in the lamplight as his mother spun these tales of divine ancestry. Whether true or not, these stories planted seeds in Alexander's mind, seeds that would grow into an unshakable belief in his own destiny. His earthly father, Philip II, was a different sort of legend entirely. Philip had transformed Macedonia from a collection of feuding tribes into a formidable military power. He was a practical man, a brilliant strategist, and a king who understood that power came not just from the sword, but from diplomacy, marriage alliances, and the loyalty of his soldiers. Philip had lost an eye in battle, walked with a limp from an old wound, and bore the scars of a dozen campaigns. Yet he was beloved by his men, and his innovations in warfare would provide the foundation for everything Alexander would later achieve. The relationship between father and son was complex, as these things often are. Philip admired Alexander's courage and quick mind, but worried about his impulsiveness and the dreams that seemed to burn so brightly in the boy's eyes. Alexander, for his part, both revered and competed with his father, eager to prove himself worthy of the throne, while chafing under Philip's shadow. When Alexander was 13, Philip made a decision that would profoundly shape the young prince's future. He hired the great philosopher Aristotle to serve as Alexander's tutor. Imagine the scene in a quiet grove outside the city of Mysa. The greatest mind of the age sits with a handful of young nobles, including the future conqueror of the world. Aristotle, with his penetrating gaze and measured words, opens up entire universes of knowledge to these eager students. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander learned not just the arts of war and kingship, but philosophy, medicine, literature, and the sciences. He developed a love of Homer's epic poems, particularly the Iliad, and would later carry a copy of it with him on all his campaigns. The story of Achilles, the legendary hero of the Trojan War, became a kind of template for Alexander's own ambitions. Like Achilles, he would choose a short life of glory over a long life of obscurity. But perhaps most importantly, Aristotle taught Alexander to think beyond the narrow confines of Macedonia. The philosopher spoke of distant lands, of the great Persian Empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to India, of cities filled with wonders and treasures beyond imagination. While other boys dreamed of local conquests, Alexander's imagination soared to encompass the entire known world. The lessons at Mysa lasted 3 years, and when they ended, Alexander returned to Pella a changed young man. He was now 16, tall and athletic, with the distinctive features that artists would later immortalize. The slightly tilted head, the intense gaze, the golden hair that fell in waves to his shoulders. But more than his physical appearance, it was his presence that commanded attention. Soldiers and courtiers alike sensed something extraordinary about the young prince, a kind of inner fire that set him apart from other young nobles. Philip was preparing for his greatest campaign, yet, the invasion of the Persian Empire. For decades, the Greeks had smarted under the memory of Persian invasions, when Xerxes had burned Athens and threatened to enslave all of Greece. Philip planned to lead a pan-Hellenic crusade to avenge these ancient wrongs, and to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor that still groaned under Persian rule. It was to be the crowning achievement of his reign, the campaign that would secure his place in history alongside the greatest heroes of Greece. But Alexander was not content to wait for his father's grand campaign. At 18, he had already proven himself in battle, leading the decisive cavalry charge that broke the sacred band of Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea. Philip had watched with pride, and perhaps a touch of unease, as his son displayed not just courage, but a kind of inspired leadership that turned the tide of battle. The young prince had tasted victory, and the taste was sweet. The tensions between father and son came to a head over Philip's marriage plans. The king, ever the pragmatist, had decided to take a seventh wife, a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice. This was not unusual in royal families, where marriages were tools of diplomacy and alliance. But Olympias saw it as a direct threat to her son's claim to the throne. If Philip had a son by a pure Macedonian wife, would Alexander, with his foreign mother, still be the rightful heir? The wedding feast turned into a disaster. Olympias and Alexander attended, but the atmosphere was tense. When Cleopatra's uncle, emboldened by wine, made a toast wishing for a legitimate heir to the throne, Alexander exploded with rage. He hurled his wine cup at the man, and demanded to know if Philip considered him a bastard. Philip, also drunk, drew his sword and lunged at his son, but tripped and fell. Alexander, with all the cutting wit of youth, mocked his father. Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another. The breach was complete. Alexander and Olympias fled Macedonia, and for months, the kingdom teetered on the edge of civil war. But Philip was too wise a king to let family quarrels destroy his life's work. Gradually, through intermediaries and careful diplomacy, he began to rebuild the relationship with his son. Alexander returned to court, and by the spring of 336 BCE, it seemed that the rift had healed. Philip's preparations for the Asian campaign were nearly complete. He had secured the loyalty of most Greek city-states, assembled a formidable army, and even sent an advance force across the Hellespont to establish a foothold in Asia Minor. The great adventure was about to begin, but fate, as it often does, had other plans. In the summer of 336 BCE, Philip was celebrating the marriage of his daughter Cleopatra to the king of Epirus. The wedding was to be a grand affair, with delegates from across the Greek world in attendance. It was meant to be a display of Macedonian power and prosperity, a fitting prelude to the great campaign that would make Philip the liberator of Asia. The ceremony took place in the ancient theatre of Aegae, Macedonia's old capital. As dawn broke on that fateful day, Philip prepared to enter the theatre in a magnificent procession. He wore a white cloak and a golden crown, and he had decided to walk without his usual bodyguard, as a gesture of confidence and openness to his people. It was a decision that would cost him his life. As Philip entered the theatre, a young man named Pausanias stepped forward from the crowd. Pausanias was a member of the royal bodyguard, a man with a personal grievance against the king. In a swift, violent moment, he plunged a dagger into Philip's heart. The king of Macedonia, the man who had dreamed of conquering Asia, died almost instantly on the stones of the theatre. Chaos erupted. Guards chased Pausanias, who tried to escape on horseback, but was caught and killed before he could be questioned. The delegates and wedding guests fled in panic. In the space of a few heartbeats, the carefully laid plans of years were thrown into uncertainty. But amidst the chaos, one voice rose clear and commanding. Alexander, though only 20 years old, stepped forward to take control of the situation. He secured the loyalty of the army, arrested potential rivals, and within days had consolidated his hold on power. The young prince had become King Alexander III of Macedonia. The great nobles of the kingdom, expected the young king to abandon his father's ambitious plans. After all, what did a 20-year-old know of ruling a kingdom, much less conquering an empire? Surely he would be content to secure his borders and rule quietly over his mountain kingdom. They could not have been more wrong. Alexander's first actions as king revealed the extraordinary mind that had been shaped by Aristotle's teachings and his own burning ambition. He moved with a speed and decisiveness that caught his enemies off guard. When the Greek city-states, hearing of Philip's death, began to rebel against Macedonian hegemony, Alexander marched south with such rapidity that he appeared at the gates of Thebes before the city's leaders even knew he had left Macedonia. The lesson was clear: this young king was not to be underestimated. The Greeks, faced with Alexander's army at their doorstep, quickly submitted, all except Thebes, which continued to resist. Alexander's response was swift and brutal. He besieged the city, took it by storm, and razed it to the ground. Of the ancient city that had once challenged even Athens for supremacy in Greece, nothing remained but rubble and memories.
It was a harsh lesson, but an effective one. The other Greek cities took note, and when Alexander called for their support in the campaign against Persia, they readily agreed. The young king had proven that he possessed not just his father's military genius, but also the ruthless determination necessary to hold together a fractious alliance of Greek city-states. As winter approached in 335 BCE, Alexander had secured his northern borders, crushed rebellion in the south, and consolidated his power in ways that would have impressed even Philip. But all of this was merely preparation for the great adventure that lay ahead. The Persian Empire, vast and wealthy beyond imagination, waited across the narrow strait of the Hellespont. Alexander spent the winter months in careful preparation. He studied maps and intelligence reports, consulted with his generals, and refined the military machine that Philip had created. The Macedonian army that would cross into Asia was a marvel of organization and training. At its heart were the companions, the elite heavy cavalry that Alexander himself would lead. These were the sons of Macedonian nobles, bound to their king by ties of personal loyalty and honor. The infantry was anchored by the famous Macedonian phalanx, ranks of soldiers carrying sarissas pikes nearly 20 feet long that could hold off any cavalry charge while presenting a bristling wall of bronze spear points to any infantry attack. Supporting them were archers, slingers and engineers capable of building siege equipment or bridging rivers. But perhaps most importantly, Alexander had assembled a remarkable group of commanders. There was Parmenion, the old general who had served Philip faithfully for decades, and who brought wisdom and experience to balance Alexander's youthful audacity. There was Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend and most trusted companion, who understood the king's mind as no one else did. There was Craterus, solid and dependable, the kind of man who could be trusted with the most difficult assignments. And there was Antigonus, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and a dozen others who would prove themselves in the campaigns ahead. As spring returned to Macedonia in 334 BCE, Alexander's preparations were complete. The army was assembled, the ships were ready, and the young king himself was eager to begin the great adventure. He had spent months studying the campaigns of his heroes Achilles, who had fought at Troy, and Heracles, who had traveled to the ends of the earth. Now it was his turn to write his name in the annals of legend. But before he could cross into Asia, there was one more piece of business to complete. Alexander visited the oracle at Delphi, seeking the blessing of Apollo for his enterprise. The oracle, however, was not in session, and the priestess refused to give a prophecy. Alexander, never one to be deterred by such obstacles, grabbed the priestess and began dragging her toward the sacred chamber. "You are invincible, my son," she cried, trying to escape his grasp. Alexander smiled and released her. "That is all the prophecy I need," he said. And so, as the first warm days of spring melted the snows on the mountains of Macedonia, Alexander prepared to cross the Hellespont and step into immortality. The young king, who had inherited a small kingdom in the mountains of Greece, was about to begin a journey that would take him to the ends of the known world and beyond. The morning sun rises over the Hellespont, casting golden ripples across the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia. It is spring, 334 BCE, and on the European shore, an army unlike any the world has ever seen prepares to cross into legend. At its head stands Alexander,
now 22 years old, his armor gleaming in the dawn light, his eyes fixed on the distant Asian shore where destiny awaits. Let your mind drift peacefully across those ancient waters, imagining the sight that would have greeted you on that momentous day. 35,000 men, the finest soldiers Macedonia and Greece could produce, stand ready to embark on the greatest adventure in human history. The morning air is filled with the gentle sounds of preparation, the soft nickering of horses, the quiet murmur of soldiers, checking their equipment one final time, the creak of leather and the whisper of bronze against bronze. Alexander had spent the previous evening in careful ritual, as was his way. He had sacrificed to the gods, seeking their blessing for the great enterprise ahead. He had consulted his copy of Homer's Iliad, reading once again the story of Achilles and the heroes who had crossed these same waters centuries before to fight at Troy. Like his hero Achilles, Alexander understood that he was choosing a path that would lead either to immortal glory or to an early grave. The choice, he believed, was an easy one. As the first ships pushed off from the European shore, Alexander performed one final dramatic gesture. Standing at the prow of his vessel, he hurled his spear into the Asian shore, claiming the continent by right of conquest before he had even set foot upon it. It was a moment of pure theatre, but theatre with a purpose. Every soldier in that army understood that they were crossing not just a body of water, but a threshold into history itself. The landing at Abydos proceeded without opposition. The Persian fleet, though formidable, was not present to contest the crossing. Alexander had timed his invasion carefully, knowing that the Persian Empire, vast though it was, could not be everywhere at once. As his soldiers disembarked on the Asian shore, Alexander was the first to leap from his ship, fully armed, claiming Asia as his prize before the gods and men. But before marching inland, Alexander had a pilgrimage to make. Not far from his landing site lay the ancient city of Troy, the setting of Homer's great epic. Here, according to legend, Achilles had fought and died for glory and honor. Alexander could not resist the pull of this sacred ground. He left his army to establish camp and set out with a small party of companions to pay his respects to the heroes of old. The ruins of Troy were ancient even in Alexander's time, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Yet for the young king, they were alive with the presence of the past. He made sacrifices at the supposed tomb of Achilles, his hero and role model. He ran naked around the monument, as was the custom, anointing it with oil and crowning it with flowers. His friend Hephaestion performed the same ritual at the tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion. The symbolism was clear to all who witnessed it. Alexander saw himself as a new Achilles, embarking on a quest that would echo through the ages. But Alexander was not content with mere symbolism. In the temple of Athena at Troy, he exchanged his own armor for ancient weapons said to have been used in the Trojan War. He would carry these throughout his campaigns, linking himself tangibly to the heroes of legend. Some might call it superstition, but Alexander understood the power of symbols to inspire both himself and his men. From Troy, Alexander marched inland, following the coastal road that wound through the hills of Asia Minor. The countryside was beautiful in the spring, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and streams running clear and cold from the mountains. It was easy to imagine that this was a peaceful journey, a pleasant march through friendly territory. But Alexander and his commanders knew better. Somewhere ahead waited the Persian army, and with it, the first real test of their ambitions. The Persian forces in Asia Minor were commanded by a group of satraps, provincial governors, who ruled their territories with the authority of the great king himself. They had been expecting Alexander's invasion, and they had prepared for it in their own fashion. Rather than contest the landing, they had decided to draw the invaders inland, where they could be destroyed far from their ships and their line of retreat. The Persian plan was sound in theory. They would avoid pitched battle with the Macedonian phalanx, which they knew to be formidable, and instead rely on their superior numbers and their knowledge of the terrain. They would harass Alexander's supply lines, attack his foragers, and gradually wear down his army through attrition. It was a strategy that had worked before against other invaders, and there was no reason to think it would not work again. But the satraps had reckoned without Alexander's extraordinary speed and audacity. The young king had no intention of allowing himself to be drawn into a prolonged campaign of maneuver and counter-maneuver. He needed a decisive victory, and he needed it quickly. His treasury was not bottomless, and his army, far from home, could not afford to be bogged down in a war of attrition. The confrontation came sooner than either side expected. As Alexander's army approached the river Granicus, his scouts reported that the Persian forces were drawn up on the far bank, ready to contest the crossing. It was a strong position. The riverbank was steep and slippery, and any army attempting to cross would have to do so under a rain of arrows and javelins. The Persian commanders had chosen their ground well. Many of Alexander's own generals advised caution. Parmenion, the old veteran who had served Philip faithfully for decades, urged the king to wait. "The month is unlucky for battle," he argued, referring to the Macedonian superstition that discouraged fighting during the month of Dasius. "Let us camp here and cross at dawn, when we can see the enemy positions clearly." But Alexander was not in the mood for delay. "I would be ashamed," he replied, "if after crossing the Hellespont so easily, I were to be stopped by this little stream." His decision was made. The battle would be fought immediately, regardless of the disadvantages. The Battle of the Granicus was Alexander's first major engagement as king, and it would set the pattern for all his subsequent victories. Rather than attempting to cross the river with his entire army, he led a small force of his elite companions in a direct assault on the strongest part of the Persian line. It was a move of breathtaking audacity, and it nearly cost him his life. As Alexander and his cavalry splashed across the river, the Persian nobles rushed to meet them. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in the shallow water, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Alexander found himself surrounded by enemy warriors, his horse killed beneath him, his armor dented and his helmet knocked askew. For a moment, it seemed that the great adventure might end almost before it had begun. But then, as so often in Alexander's career, individual courage and the loyalty of his men turned the tide. Clytus, one of Alexander's bodyguards, struck down a Persian noble, who was about to deliver a killing blow to the king. Other companions rallied to their leader's side, and gradually, the Persian line began to waver.
The breakthrough came when Alexander's infantry, inspired by their king's example, forced their way across the river at several points. The Persian cavalry, magnificent as they were, could not stand against the disciplined advance of the Macedonian phalanx. As their line began to crumble, panic spread through the Persian ranks. What had begun as an orderly defense became a rout. The victory at the Granicus was complete, but it was also costly. Alexander had lost relatively few men, but among the dead were some of his most trusted officers. The young king himself had come within inches of death, and the experience sobered him. He would never again be quite so reckless with his own life, understanding that his survival was essential to the success of the entire enterprise. More importantly, the victory at the Granicus opened the door to Western Asia Minor. The Persian satraps were dead or in flight, and the Greek cities of the coast, which had been under Persian rule for 2 centuries, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. City after city opened its gates to the Macedonian army, and Alexander was careful to present himself not as a conqueror, but as a champion of Greek freedom. The march down the coast was a triumph. At Ephesus, Alexander restored the democratic government that had been overthrown by the Persians. At Miletus, he besieged and captured the Persian garrison, adding to his growing reputation as a military genius. At Halicarnassus, he faced his first serious siege, against a city defended by Memnon of Rhodes, one of the few Persian commanders who understood how to fight the Macedonians effectively. The siege of Halicarnassus was a learning experience for Alexander. The city was strongly fortified, and Memnon had prepared his defenses carefully. For weeks the Macedonians battered the walls with their siege engines, while the defenders launched sorties and counterattacks. It was a different kind of warfare from the open battles that Alexander preferred, requiring patience and methodical planning rather than brilliant improvisation. But Alexander was nothing if not adaptable. He studied the art of siege warfare with the same intensity he had once applied to philosophy under Aristotle. He learned to coordinate his engineers and his assault troops, to time his attacks for maximum effect, and to maintain the morale of his soldiers during the long, grinding days of siege warfare. The fall of Halicarnassus was inevitable, but Memnon managed to escape with most of his garrison, denying Alexander the complete victory he had hoped for. It was a reminder that the Persian Empire was not without capable defenders.
and that the road to ultimate victory would be long and difficult. As winter approached, Alexander made a decision that revealed his strategic wisdom. Rather than attempting to continue his advance into the interior of Asia Minor during the harsh winter months, he divided his army. Part of his forces, under the command of Parmenion, would winter in the territories already conquered, securing his gains and preparing for the next year's campaign. Alexander himself, with a picked force of his best troops, would march south into the mountains of Lycia and Pamphylia, reducing the coastal cities and denying them to any Persian fleet that might threaten his rear. The winter campaign was a masterpiece of mountain warfare. Alexander's soldiers, accustomed to the harsh winters of Macedonia, adapted quickly to the rugged terrain of the Anatolian mountains. They marched through snow-covered passes, forded ice-cold streams, and fought a series of small but vicious battles against the hill tribes who had allied themselves with Persia. The most dramatic moment of the winter campaign came at the climax, a narrow pass where the road clung to the face of a cliff above the sea. Local tradition held that the path was impassable when the south wind blew, driving the waves high against the rocks. But Alexander, with his usual disregard for conventional wisdom, chose to make the passage during a storm. The sight must have been extraordinary. Thousands of soldiers, their cloaks whipping in the wind, their armor gleaming wet with spray, picking their way carefully along the narrow ledge while the waves crashed below them. Alexander himself led the way, demonstrating once again that he would never ask his men to face dangers he was not willing to share. The successful passage of the climax became another addition to Alexander's growing legend. His soldiers began to believe that their king was indeed favored by the gods, that no obstacle could stand before him. This belief, as much as any tactical innovation, would prove crucial in the battles ahead. As spring returned to Asia Minor in 333 BCE, Alexander reunited his army and prepared for the next phase of his campaign. The easy victories of the previous year were behind him now. Ahead lay the heartland of the Persian Empire, and waiting for him there was Darius III, the great king himself, with an army that dwarfed anything Alexander had yet faced. But the young Macedonian king was no longer the untested youth who had crossed the Hellespont a year earlier. He had learned the arts of siege warfare and mountain fighting. He had seen his men face death and emerge victorious. He had felt the weight of command and the responsibility of leading an army far from home. Most importantly, he had begun to understand the true scale of the task before him. The Persian Empire was not just a collection of territories to be conquered. It was a civilization thousands of years old, with customs and traditions that stretched back to the dawn of history. To truly conquer it, Alexander would need more than military genius. He would need to understand it, to adapt to it, and ultimately, to transform himself from a Macedonian king into something entirely new, a ruler who could command the loyalty of Greeks and Persians alike. But that transformation still lay in the future. For now, as Alexander prepared to march inland toward the great cities of Syria and Mesopotamia, he was still the young king who had thrown his spear into the Asian shore. The greatest challenges of his career lay ahead, and with them, the victories that would make him master of the known world. The morning sun climbed higher over the mountains of Asia Minor, and Alexander's army prepared to march deeper into the vast Persian Empire. Behind them lay the familiar blue waters of the Aegean, the last link to the Greek world they had known. Ahead lay the unknown, the great adventure that would test every skill they possessed, and every bond of loyalty that held them together. On the right wing, Alexander had positioned his companions, the elite heavy cavalry that he himself would lead. These were the sons of Macedonian nobles, men who had grown up with Alexander, and who would follow him to the ends of the earth. Their horses were the finest that money could buy, their armor was crafted by the best smiths in Greece, and their courage had been tested in a dozen battles. The left wing was commanded by Parmenion, the old general who had served Philip faithfully, and who now brought his vast experience to bear in support of Alexander's bold strategies. Here were positioned the Thessalian cavalry, renowned throughout Greece for their skill, and the allied Greek infantry, fighting not just for Alexander, but for the cause of Greek freedom. As dawn broke on the first day of November, 333 BCE, the two armies faced each other across the narrow plain of Issus. The sight must have been breathtaking. On one side, Alexander's compact, disciplined force of 35,000 men, their bronze armor gleaming in the morning sun. On the other, Darius's vast host stretching from the mountains to the sea, a sea of color and movement that seemed to have no end. Darius himself was impossible to miss. He rode in a magnificent chariot, his robes purple and gold, his tiara sparkling with jewels. Around him were gathered the immortals, the 10,000 elite guards who formed the backbone of the Persian army. Behind them, rank upon rank of soldiers from every corner of the empire created a display of power that was meant to intimidate as much as to fight. But Alexander had learned not to be impressed by mere spectacle. He had studied the Persian way of war, and he understood its strengths and weaknesses. The Persian army was magnificent to look at, but it was also unwieldy, difficult to maneuver, and dependent on its numerical advantage. If he could disrupt their formation and create chaos in their ranks, his smaller but more disciplined force might achieve the impossible. The battle began at dawn with a series of skirmishes along the Panarus River, the small stream that separated the two armies. Alexander had positioned his light troops, slingers and javelin men to contest the crossing and to disrupt the Persian deployment. For hours the two sides exchanged volleys of missiles, each trying to gain a psychological advantage before the main battle began. As the morning wore on, Alexander made his final dispositions. He would lead the companions in a charge against the left wing of the Persian army, hoping to break through and roll up their entire line. At the same time, the phalanx would advance in the center, using its massive pikes to hold the Persian infantry in place while Alexander's cavalry did its work. But the plan began to go wrong almost immediately. The terrain was more difficult than Alexander had anticipated. The riverbank was steep and slippery, and the Persian archers had positioned themselves to rake the advancing Macedonians with arrows. As the phalanx struggled to maintain its formation while crossing the stream, gaps began to appear in the line. Darius, showing the tactical skill that had made him king, immediately exploited these gaps. He sent forward his Greek mercenaries, 10,000 professional soldiers who were every bit as skilled as Alexander's own troops. These men, fighting for gold rather than glory, smashed into the disordered Macedonian line with devastating effect. For a moment it seemed as if the entire Macedonian center might collapse. Alexander's carefully laid plans were unraveling, and the great adventure that had begun so promisingly might end in disaster on the banks of an obscure river in Asia Minor. But this was the moment when Alexander's true genius revealed itself, not in the planning, but in the improvisation, not in the careful preparation, but in the split-second decisions that separate great commanders from merely good ones. Seeing the crisis in his center, Alexander made a decision that would echo through history. Instead of continuing his planned assault on the Persian left wing, he wheeled his companions around and charged directly at the center of the Persian line, directly at Darius himself. It was a move of breathtaking audacity, abandoning all tactical orthodoxy in favor of a desperate gamble. The charge of the companions was like a thunderbolt. Alexander, his white-plumed helmet making him unmistakable in the melee, led from the front, his long lance seeking out the most dangerous enemies. Behind him his cavalry struck the Persian line like a hammer blow, their momentum carrying them deep into the enemy ranks. The effect on the Persian army was electric. Soldiers who had been advancing confidently moments before, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives as armored horsemen crashed into their midst. The carefully ordered lines began to dissolve into chaos as men fled from the Macedonian charge or turned to face this new threat. But the real target of Alexander's charge was not the Persian soldiers, it was their king. Darius, magnificent in his golden chariot, had become the focal point of the battle. If Alexander could reach him, if he could strike down the great king himself, the Persian Empire would collapse like a house of cards. The race to reach Darius became the climax of the battle. Alexander, fighting like a man possessed, cut his way through the Persian guards, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision. Around him, his companions fought with equal fury, knowing that the fate of their entire expedition hung in the balance. Darius, for his part, showed no lack of courage. He fought from his chariot with bow and spear, his purple robes soon stained with blood, though whether it was his own or that of his enemies, no one could say. For long minutes the two kings fought within sight of each other, the fate of the ancient world balanced on the edge of their swords. But numbers began to tell. The Persian guards, brave as they were, could not stand against the concentrated assault of Alexander's veterans. One by one, they fell, until only a thin line of men stood between the Macedonian king and his Persian rival. It was then that Darius made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Seeing his guards overwhelmed and Alexander's sword only yards away, he turned his chariot and fled. The sight of their king in retreat broke the morale of the Persian army. What had been an orderly battle became a rout as thousands of soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. Alexander pursued the fleeing Persians for miles, his cavalry cutting down fugitives and capturing the baggage train. But the real prize eluded him. Darius escaped into the mountains, leaving behind his chariot, his royal robes, and something even more precious, his family. The Persian royal tent was a wonder to behold. Carpets from the finest workshops of the empire covered the ground, while gold and silver vessels reflected the light of oil lamps. But it was the occupants of the tent that truly amazed the Macedonians. Darius's mother, wife and daughters had been traveling with the army, as was the Persian custom, and they now found themselves prisoners of the man they had been taught to see as a barbarian. Alexander's treatment of the royal women became another chapter in his growing legend. Instead of the rough treatment they might have expected from a conqueror, he showed them the courtesy due to queens. He assured them that they would be treated with honor, that their needs would be met, and that they had nothing to fear from him personally. The gesture was both humane and politically astute. By treating the Persian royal family with respect, Alexander demonstrated that he was not merely a destroyer but a potential ruler, someone who could command the loyalty of Persian nobles as well as Macedonian soldiers. It was a lesson in statecraft that would serve him well in the years to come. The victory at Issus was complete, but its implications went far beyond the immediate military situation. Alexander had not just defeated a Persian army, he had defeated the great king himself, the man who claimed to rule the world by divine right. The psychological impact of this victory resonated throughout the Persian Empire, from the courts of Babylon to the markets of Samarkand. But perhaps more importantly, the battle had revealed Alexander's true character to his own men. They had seen their young king charge into the thick of battle, had watched him risk everything on a single desperate gamble, and had witnessed his victory against impossible odds. If they had followed him before out of duty or hope of plunder, they would follow him now out of something approaching worship. The aftermath of the battle was as important as the fighting itself. Alexander spent days carefully organizing his victory, ensuring that his soldiers received their share of the enormous booty, that the wounded were cared for, and that the dead were honored with proper burial. He also began the delicate process of incorporating Persian nobles into his administration, showing that he intended to rule the empire, not simply to loot it. As winter approached, Alexander faced a strategic decision. He could pursue Darius into the mountains, hoping to finish the war with one more victory, or he could consolidate his gains, secure his position, and prepare for the longer campaign that seemed increasingly inevitable. Alexander chose consolidation, but not the passive kind that his enemies might have expected. Instead of wintering in comfortable quarters, he turned south toward the great cities of the Levant, toward Tyre and Gaza, toward the wealth of Egypt and the ancient wisdom of the Nile. The war was far from over, but the Battle of Issus had established Alexander as a legitimate contender for the throne of the world. The Mediterranean sun casts long shadows across the ancient stones of Tyre, as Alexander stands on the mainland, gazing across the narrow strait that separates him from the island fortress. It is the spring of 332 BCE, 6 months after his stunning victory at Issus, and the young king faces a challenge unlike any he has encountered before. Behind him his army rests in their camps, their spirits high from recent victories. Before him lies a city that has never fallen to siege, protected by the sea itself, and defended by walls that seem to rise from the very waves. Let your mind drift peacefully to that moment when Alexander first beheld the island city of Tyre. Picture the ancient Phoenician stronghold, its towers gleaming white against the blue Mediterranean, its harbors filled with the ships of merchants from every corner of the known world. This was no ordinary city, but the crown jewel of Phoenician civilization, a place where purple dye was worth more than gold, and where the alphabet itself had been born. The path to Tyre had been paved with diplomacy as much as conquest. After his victory at Issus, Alexander had spent the winter months consolidating his position along the eastern Mediterranean coast. One by one, the great cities of the Levant had opened their gates to him. Damascus, with its gardens and palaces, had surrendered without a fight. Sidon, the ancient rival of Tyre, had welcomed him as a liberator. Even Jerusalem, that holy city of the Jews, had submitted to his authority, though the priests had demanded assurances that their temple would remain inviolate. But Tyre was different. The Tyrians had listened politely to Alexander's ambassadors, had admired the gifts he sent, and had proclaimed their neutrality in his war against Persia. They would trade with him, they said. They would provide supplies for his army, but they would not submit to occupation. Their city had stood for over 1,000 years, had survived the assaults of Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus, and would outlast this young Macedonian upstart as well. Alexander's response was characteristically direct. If Tyre would not submit, it would be destroyed. The city's location on an island half a mile from shore, protected by walls over 100 feet high, made it seem impregnable. But Alexander had learned from his father Philip that there was no such thing as an impregnable fortress, only fortresses that had not yet been properly attacked. The solution he devised was audacious even by his standards. If the sea protected Tyre, then the sea would be eliminated. Alexander ordered the construction of a causeway, a massive earthwork that would stretch from the mainland to the island, creating a permanent bridge across the strait. It was a project that would have daunted the engineers of Rome, but Alexander's men set to work with the enthusiasm of soldiers who had learned to believe that their king could accomplish anything. The construction of the causeway became an epic in itself. Thousands of men labored day and night, hauling stones from the ruins of old Tyre on the mainland, felling cedar trees from the mountains of Lebanon, and slowly, inexorably, building a road across the sea. The Tyrians, initially amused by what seemed like a futile gesture, soon realized the deadly seriousness of Alexander's intent. As the causeway crept closer to their walls, the Tyrians launched increasingly desperate attacks. Their ships, the finest in the Mediterranean, struck at the construction crews with fire arrows and catapults. Their divers swam out under cover of darkness to sabotage the work, pulling up the stones and cutting the wooden supports. But for every setback, Alexander's engineers found a solution. They built towers on the causeway to protect the workers. They stretched nets underwater to catch the divers, and they never stopped building. The siege of Tyre lasted 7 months, and it became a contest of wills as much as a military operation. Alexander personally supervised the work, often laboring alongside his soldiers to show that no task was beneath him. When the Tyrians sent a ship loaded with combustibles to burn the siege engines, Alexander was there to organize the firefighting efforts. When their catapults threatened to make the causeway uninhabitable, he was there to direct the construction of protective barriers. But it was not just determination that won the siege, it was innovation. Alexander's engineers developed new techniques for underwater construction, created movable towers that could be advanced safely across the causeway, and designed battering rams of unprecedented size and power. The siege of Tyre became a laboratory for military engineering, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in ancient warfare. The end, when it came, was swift and terrible. After months of gradual progress, the causeway finally reached the island's shores. The great battering rams, some of them over 100 feet long, began their work on the walls. At the same time, Alexander's fleet, assembled from the ships of allied cities, launched a coordinated assault from the sea. The defenders, exhausted by months of siege, could no longer hold every point of their perimeter. The final assault began at dawn, with Alexander himself leading the charge across the causeway. The sight of their king in the thick of battle, his armor gleaming in the morning sun, inspired the Macedonians to superhuman efforts. The walls were scaled, the gates were broken, and the city that had stood unconquered for a millennium fell to the young king from Macedonia. But the fall of Tyre was not the end of Alexander's challenges in the region. Gaza, the fortress city that controlled the approaches to Egypt, still held out under its brave governor Battus. The siege of Gaza was briefer but no less bitter than that of Tyre. The city's position on a high mound made it nearly as formidable as the island fortress, and its defenders fought with the desperate courage of men who knew that surrender meant death. Alexander himself was wounded during the assault on Gaza, an arrow piercing his shoulder as he led an attack on the walls. But even wounded, he continued to direct the siege, his presence inspiring his soldiers to greater efforts. When Gaza finally fell, its governor Battus was brought before Alexander in chains. The young king, still in pain from his wound and frustrated by the long resistance, showed a side of his character that his admirers preferred to forget. Battus was dragged behind a chariot until he died, a fate that recalled the treatment of Hector by Achilles in Homer's Iliad. But if Alexander could be cruel in victory, he was also capable of remarkable magnanimity. When he entered Egypt in the autumn of 332 BCE, he showed the wisdom that would make him not just a conqueror, but a ruler. The Egyptians, who had chafed under Persian rule for 2 centuries, welcomed him as a liberator. The priests of Memphis, the ancient capital, performed the sacred rituals that made him pharaoh of Egypt, heir to a tradition that stretched back to the days of the pyramid builders.
It was in Egypt that Alexander encountered one of the most transformative experiences of his life. He had heard stories of the oracle of Ammon, the god whom the Greeks identified with Zeus, whose temple lay in the oasis of Siwa, deep in the western desert. The journey to Siwa was perilous, a trek across hundreds of miles of burning sand, where caravans regularly disappeared without trace. But Alexander was determined to consult the oracle, driven by questions that had haunted him since childhood. The expedition to Siwa was a spiritual journey as much as a physical one. Alexander traveled with only a small group of companions, leaving the main army behind in Memphis. For days they marched across the trackless desert, guided by local nomads who knew the secret paths between the oases. The heat was crushing, the thirst constant, and the landscape seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. But the desert also had its own terrible beauty. At night, when the temperatures dropped and the stars appeared in their countless millions, Alexander would lie on his back and contemplate the immensity of the universe. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind across the sand and the distant howl of jackals. It was in this vast emptiness that Alexander began to understand the true scope of his ambitions, not just to conquer the known world, but to transcend the limitations of ordinary mortality. The Oracle of Ammon, when they finally reached it, was both magnificent and mysterious. The temple, built of local stone and decorated with hieroglyphs that told the story of gods and kings, stood in a grove of palm trees fed by a sacred spring. The priests, their heads shaved and their bodies wrapped in white linen, greeted Alexander with elaborate ceremonies that seemed to acknowledge his divine nature. What passed between Alexander and the oracle was never fully revealed. The priests spoke to him in private, their words delivered in the form of riddles and symbols that required interpretation. But when Alexander emerged from the inner sanctuary, his companions noticed a change in him. He walked with a new confidence, spoke with a new authority, and seemed to carry about him an aura of divinity that had not been there before. The oracle, according to the stories that later circulated, had confirmed what Alexander had long suspected, that he was not merely the son of Philip of Macedon, but the son of Zeus himself, born of a mortal woman but destined for immortal glory. Whether Alexander truly believed this, or simply found it politically useful, the visit to Siwa marked a turning point in his career. From that moment forward, he would see himself not just as a king but as a god-king, destined to rule by divine right. The practical implications of this revelation were enormous. In the complex world of ancient Near Eastern politics, divine kingship was a familiar concept. The pharaohs of Egypt, the kings of Babylon, and the great kings of Persia all claimed to rule by divine mandate. By asserting his own divinity, Alexander was not just satisfying his personal ambitions, but positioning himself as the legitimate heir to all these traditions. The foundation of Alexandria was the most visible expression of this new status. The city that would bear Alexander's name was planned on a scale that reflected his divine ambitions. Located on the Mediterranean coast at the mouth of the Nile, it was designed to be the greatest port in the world, a place where the trade routes of Africa, Asia, and Europe would converge. Alexander personally selected the site, walking the boundaries of the future city and marking the locations of its most important buildings. The harbor would be protected by a massive lighthouse, one of the wonders of the ancient world. The library would contain all the knowledge of humanity,
making Alexandria the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. The palace complex would rival anything in Babylon or Persepolis, while the tomb prepared for Alexander himself would be a monument to his divine nature. But even as he planned for eternity, Alexander was preparing for his next campaign. Darius had not been idle during the months of the siege of Tyre and the conquest of Egypt. The great king had retreated to the heartland of his empire, to the ancient cities of Babylon and Susa, where he was assembling another army. This time he was determined not to repeat the mistakes of Issus. He would choose the battlefield, fight on ground that favored his massive cavalry forces, and crush the Macedonian pretender once and for all. The reports that reached Alexandria spoke of an army that dwarfed even the host that had fought at Issus. Darius had summoned warriors from every corner of his empire, elephants from India, scythed chariots from the steppes, and countless thousands of cavalry from the horse-loving peoples of the east. He had also hired the best Greek mercenaries that money could buy, men who knew Macedonian tactics, and could teach the Persians how to counter them. Alexander's response was to intensify his own preparations. He spent the winter months in Egypt training his army, incorporating new tactics and weapons that would give him an advantage in the coming battle. He also continued his diplomatic efforts, sending envoys to the cities of Greece to ensure their continued loyalty, and negotiating with the satraps of the Persian Empire, who might be willing to change sides. As spring arrived in 331 BCE, Alexander knew that the time for delay was over. Darius was challenging him to single combat on the plains of Mesopotamia, and he could not refuse without losing face throughout the empire. The campaign that would decide the fate of the ancient world was about to begin. The march from Egypt to Mesopotamia was a masterpiece of military logistics. Alexander's army, now numbering over 40,000 men, moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Supply columns stretched for miles, carrying everything from siege engines to medical supplies. Engineers went ahead to repair roads and build bridges, while scouts ranged far and wide to gather intelligence about Persian movements. But it was not just the practical aspects of the march that occupied Alexander's attention. He used the journey to continue building the legend that surrounded him. He consulted oracles and made sacrifices to the gods, always in public where his soldiers could see him. He visited the wounded in the medical tents, remembered the names of common soldiers, and shared the hardships of the march. By the time they reached the plains of Mesopotamia, his army was not just well-equipped and well-trained, it was utterly devoted to its divine commander. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind rest on the image of that young god-king, standing on the banks of the Tigris River, gazing across the vast plains where the greatest battle of the ancient world was about to unfold. Behind him the sun sets over the pyramids of Egypt, where his name is already carved in stone among the pharaohs. Ahead the campfires of the Persian army twinkle like stars in the darkness, promising a confrontation that will shake the foundations of the world. The dawn mist rises from the plains of Gaugamela, as Alexander stands with his generals, studying the vast Persian encampment that stretches to the horizon. It is October 1st, 331 BCE, and the young king knows that this day will determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of the civilized world. Behind him 47,000 Macedonians and Greeks prepare for what may be their final battle. Before him, across the carefully prepared battlefield, Darius has assembled over 250,000 soldiers in the greatest military display in human history. Let your mind drift peacefully to that moment when the morning star still shines above the eastern horizon, and Alexander makes his final preparations for the battle that will echo through eternity. Picture the scene. The Persian army spread out like a glittering sea of bronze and gold, their banners snapping in the morning breeze, their war elephants trumpeting challenges to the sky. And facing them, compact and disciplined, the Macedonian stands ready, their sarissas gleaming like a forest of deadly thorns. The road to Gaugamela had been long and fraught with tension. After leaving Egypt, Alexander had marched his army across the desert wastes of Syria, through the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, and finally to this chosen battlefield, near the ancient city of Nineveh. Darius had learned from his defeat at Issus. This time, he would not be caught in the narrow confines of a coastal plain. He had selected the plains of Gaugamela, precisely because they offered unlimited space for his cavalry to maneuver, and he had spent months preparing the ground to his advantage. The battlefield itself was a testament to Persian thoroughness. Engineers had worked for weeks to level the ground, removing rocks and obstacles that might impede the charge of the scythed chariots. The soil had been packed hard to provide perfect footing for the cavalry, and the entire plain had been surveyed and marked to ensure that every Persian unit knew exactly where to position itself. It was in effect a giant killing field designed specifically to maximize the advantages of the Persian way of war. Alexander's scouts had reported all these preparations, and the young king had spent sleepless nights studying the intelligence reports and planning his response. He knew that he could not match Darius in numbers. The Persian army outnumbered his own by more than 5-1. But he also knew that battles were not won by numbers alone. At Marathon, the Greeks had defeated a far larger Persian army. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans had held off the might of Xerxes. Superior training, better tactics, and inspired leadership could overcome even the greatest numerical disadvantage. The night before the battle, Alexander had done something unprecedented. While his soldiers slept, he had walked through the camp visiting every unit, speaking with the officers, and ensuring that every man understood his role in the coming fight. He had checked the equipment personally, examined the horses, and made certain that the supply trains were properly organized. Most remarkably, he had spent time with the wounded from previous battles, assuring them that their sacrifices had not been forgotten, and that their comrades would fight with doubled fury in their honor. But it was not just the physical preparations that occupied Alexander's mind in those final hours. He was acutely aware that this battle would be different from all the others. At the Granicus and at Issus, he had been fighting for conquest, for glory, for the expansion of his kingdom. But at Gaugamela, he was fighting for something far more profound, for the right to claim the throne of the world itself. The Persian army that faced him was not just a collection of soldiers, but a representation of an entire civilization. For over 2 centuries, the Persians had ruled the largest empire in human history, stretching from the shores of the Mediterranean to the valleys of the Indus. Their kings had been worshipped as gods, their satraps had governed provinces larger than most Greek city-states, and their culture had blended the wisdom of Egypt, the learning of Babylon, and the military traditions of the Iranian plateau. Darius himself embodied this ancient tradition. He was not just a general but a god-king, the heir to Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great, the ruler whose word was law from the Black Sea to the Indian Ocean. His presence on the battlefield was meant to inspire not just his own soldiers, but to remind the world that the Persian Empire was eternal, that it had survived other challenges, and would survive this one as well. But Alexander had his own claims to divinity. His visit to the oracle of Ammon had confirmed what he had always suspected, that he was the son of Zeus, destined to rule by divine right. The priests of Egypt had proclaimed him pharaoh, making him the heir to the oldest royal tradition in the world. The cities of Greece had hailed him as their hegemon, the leader of the Hellenic crusade against the barbarians. He came to Gaugamela, not as a mere mortal king, but as a god-king challenging another god-king for supremacy. The battle began at dawn with the ritual sacrifices. Both armies watched as their priests performed the ancient ceremonies, seeking the favor of the gods for the coming fight. Alexander, dressed in armor that gleamed like the sun itself, made his offerings to Zeus and Athena, calling upon his divine father to grant him victory. Darius, magnificent in his purple robes and golden crown, invoked Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of the Persians, and asked for the strength to defend his empire. As the sun rose higher, the two armies began their final deployments. The Persian line stretched for over 2 miles, with the heavy cavalry on the wings, the infantry in the center, and the fearsome scythed chariots positioned to break the Macedonian charge. In the very center of the line, Darius himself took position in his war chariot, surrounded by his immortals and the Greek mercenaries who had sworn to fight to the death. Alexander's deployment was more compact but no less carefully planned. He placed his strongest units on the right wing, where he himself would lead the charge. The phalanx occupied the center, their long sarissas creating an impenetrable wall of bronze and iron. On the left wing, Old Parmenion commanded the Thessalian cavalry and the allied Greek forces, with orders to hold his position no matter what happened elsewhere on the battlefield. But Alexander's real innovation was his use of reserves. Unlike previous battles, where he had committed all his forces to the initial assault, he held back significant numbers of troops to respond to unexpected developments. He had learned that battles were dynamic affairs, where the side that could adapt most quickly to changing circumstances would ultimately prevail. The battle opened with the charge of the Persian chariots, a terrifying sight that had broken many armies in the past. 200 vehicles, each equipped with razor-sharp scythes on their wheels, thundered toward the Macedonian line at full gallop. The ground shook with the impact of their hoofs, and the air filled with the war cries of their drivers. It was a weapon of terror, as much as destruction, designed to shatter the enemy's morale before the real fighting began. But Alexander had prepared for this moment. Instead of meeting the charge head-on, he had trained his men to open gaps in their formation, allowing the chariots to pass through harmlessly. As each chariot rushed past, Macedonian soldiers would leap out from the sides, killing the horses and drivers with javelins and swords. Within minutes, the fearsome weapon that had terrorized the battlefields of Asia for centuries was reduced to a scattered collection of dead horses and broken wood. The failure of the chariot charge was the signal for the general assault. Along the entire Persian line, horns sounded and drums beat as hundreds of thousands of soldiers began their advance. The sight was overwhelming, wave after wave of warriors stretching to the horizon, their weapons glinting in the sunlight, their voices raised in battle cries that could be heard for miles. Alexander's response was characteristically bold. Instead of waiting for the Persian attack to reach him, he ordered his own advance, leading his companions in a wedge formation directly toward the Persian left wing. It was a move that violated every principle of defensive warfare, but it was also quintessentially Alexander, aggressive, unexpected, and designed to seize the initiative from his enemies. The clash, when it came, was like the collision of two avalanches. The Persian heavy cavalry, among the finest in the world, met Alexander's companions in a melee that shook the earth. Lances splintered, swords rang against armor, and horses screamed as they fell. In the center of the fighting, Alexander himself was unmistakable, his white-plumed helmet marking him as clearly as a banner. His long sarissa, reinforced with iron bands, punched through Persian armor with deadly efficiency. But the real crisis of the battle developed in the center, where the Macedonian phalanx struggled to maintain its formation while advancing across the uneven ground. The Persian plan was working, but the Macedonian line was stretching thin, and gaps were beginning to appear between the units. Darius, seeing his opportunity, sent forward his elite troops, the Immortals and the Greek mercenaries, to exploit these weaknesses. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as if the entire Macedonian center might collapse. The Persian troops, fighting with the desperation of men defending their homeland, smashed into the disordered phalanx with devastating effect. Alexander's most experienced soldiers, veterans of a dozen campaigns, found themselves fighting for their lives against enemies who seemed to appear from nowhere. But this was also the moment when Alexander's genius as a commander truly revealed itself. He had anticipated this crisis, had prepared for it, and had positioned his reserves exactly where they would be needed. With split-second timing, he ordered his reserve cavalry to charge into the gap that had opened in the Persian line, while his infantry reserves moved forward to support the struggling phalanx. The charge that followed was one of the most famous in military history. Alexander, abandoning his attack on the Persian left wing, wheeled his companions around, and led them in a desperate race toward the center of the battlefield. His target was not the Persian soldiers who were threatening his infantry, but Darius himself, magnificent in his golden chariot at the heart of the Persian line. The psychology of the moment was perfect. The Persian soldiers, who had been advancing confidently just minutes before, suddenly found themselves facing the most feared cavalry charge in the ancient world. Alexander's reputation preceded him. Here was the man who had never lost a battle, who had killed the champion of the Persians at the Granicus, who had driven Darius from the field at Issus. The sight of his white plume cutting through the melee like a meteor was enough to shake the confidence of even the bravest Persian warrior. But it was not just fear that drove the Persian collapse. It was the practical reality of ancient warfare. Armies of this period were held together by the personal presence of their commanders. If a general fell or fled, his soldiers would quickly follow suit. Darius, seeing Alexander's charge bearing down on him, faced the same terrible decision that had confronted him at Issus: fight to the death or preserve himself for another day. Once again, Darius chose preservation over glory. As Alexander's lance reached for his throat, the great king turned his chariot and fled the field. The sight of their god-king in retreat broke the morale of the Persian army. What had been an orderly battle became a rout as hundreds of thousands of soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. The pursuit that followed was merciless. Alexander's cavalry, their blood up from the victory, chased the fleeing Persians for miles across the plains. The Persian army, so magnificent in the morning, was scattered to the winds by evening. Darius escaped with only a handful of followers, his crown and royal robes abandoned in his haste to reach safety. The aftermath of Gaugamela was even more significant than the battle itself. Alexander had not just defeated another Persian army, he had broken the back of Persian resistance forever. The empire that had ruled the world for 2 centuries was finished, its armies scattered, its king a fugitive. From that day forward, Alexander would be fighting not to conquer Persia, but to inherit it. The immediate consequences were staggering. Babylon, the greatest city in the world, opened its gates to Alexander without a fight. The Persian treasuries, accumulated over centuries of tribute and taxation, fell into Macedonian hands. The road to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire, lay open before the young conqueror. But perhaps the most important consequence was the effect on Alexander himself. The victory at Gaugamela had confirmed his divine status in the eyes of his soldiers and his subjects. He was no longer just a Macedonian king who had gotten lucky. He was the chosen of the gods, the new master of the world. The transformation that had begun at the Oracle of Ammon was now complete. The march to Babylon was a triumphal procession. The ancient city, with its hanging gardens and towering ziggurats, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. The priests of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, performed the ceremonies that made him the legitimate heir to Nebuchadnezzar and the other great kings of Mesopotamia. The treasures of the Persian Empire were laid at his feet, gold and silver beyond counting, precious stones from the mountains of Afghanistan, silk from the markets of China. But even as he celebrated his victories, Alexander was planning his next moves. Darius was still alive, still claiming to be the legitimate great king, and still potentially dangerous. The Persian Empire was vast, with provinces and satrapies that had not yet submitted to Macedonian rule. The work of conquest was far from complete. The capture of Susa, the administrative capital of the Persian Empire, was the next logical step. The city fell without resistance, its massive treasury adding even more wealth to Alexander's growing hoard. But it was at Susa that Alexander made one of his most controversial decisions. He began to adopt Persian customs and ceremonies, presenting himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate successor to the Persian throne. The reaction among his Macedonian soldiers was mixed. Some saw it as a shrewd political move, a way to legitimize their rule over the vast populations of the empire. Others viewed it as a betrayal of everything they had fought for, a sign that their king was becoming more Persian than Macedonian. The tensions that would eventually tear Alexander's empire apart were already beginning to emerge. The final act of the conquest of Persia was the capture of Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, where the Persian kings had been crowned for over 2 centuries. The city was a wonder of the ancient world, its palaces decorated with carvings that told the story of Persian greatness, its halls filled with treasures from every corner of the empire. Alexander's treatment of Persepolis was complex and controversial. He allowed his soldiers to sack the city, taking revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece that had occurred over a century earlier. But he also preserved the most important buildings and artifacts, recognizing their historical and cultural significance. The burning of the Great Palace, whether intentional or accidental, became one of the most debated events of his reign. As winter approached in 330 BCE, Alexander could look back on a year of unprecedented success. He had defeated the greatest army in the world, captured the richest cities on earth, and established himself as the undisputed master of the largest empire in human history. But he was also aware that his greatest challenges lay ahead. The vast expanse of the Persian Empire stretched far beyond the familiar world of Greece and the Mediterranean. To the east lay lands that even the Persians had never fully conquered, the mountains of Afghanistan, the deserts of Central Asia,
and the mysterious kingdoms of India.